In 2019, the people who make The Simpsons did something they had never done in 30 years on the air. They took one of their most loved episodes, an episode fans treasured, and they erased it. Wiped it from the reruns, the streaming, the box sets, gone, like a page torn out of a book. And that is not even the strangest thing this show has done. This is a show that got threatened with a lawsuit by an entire country. A show that silenced one of its own characters forever. A show people swear can see the future. And a show fans believe has secretly been one man's dying dream since 1993. For 35 years, The Simpsons has been quietly collecting more controversy, more scandal, and more wild fan theory than any show was ever built to hold. Tonight, we are going through all of it, slowly, calmly, 10 stories deep. Welcome to Yellow Fan. Let's begin. The voice that went quiet. For almost 30 years, one of the most familiar voices on The Simpsons belonged to a man who ran a small shop. His name was Apu Nahasapima, and he stood behind the counter of the Quickie Mart, the little convenience store where the people of Springfield bought their milk, their lottery tickets, and their slightly old hot dogs that had been spinning under a warm light for far too long. Apu first showed up very early in the show, all the way back in the first season, in a 1990 episode called The Telltale Head. He was meant to be a tiny part. He was the kind of character who pops in for one quick joke and then is never seen again. That is not what happened. He stuck around, year after year, until he had become one of the most recognized faces in the whole town. Over time, the writers gave Apu a real life. He got a full name that was so long it became a joke all by itself. He got a wife named Manjula. He got 8 babies, all born on the same day, which turned into one of the busiest and loudest houses in Springfield. He got a past, a temper, a soft heart, and a habit of working impossibly long hours without ever closing the store. He sang, he fell in love, he got into trouble, and got out of it. For a character who started as background filler, Apu ended up with more of a story than most of the people who lived around him. There was one thing about Apu, though, that sat under the surface for a long time before anyone talked about it out loud. He was a man from India living in an American town run almost entirely by one joke about his accent and his job, and the person who gave him that voice was not from India at all. His name is Hank Azaria, and he is one of the small group of actors who play dozens of characters on the show. The same man who voiced Apu also voiced Mo the bartender, Chief Wiggum the police officer, and the grumpy comic book guy, among many others. Azaria has been part of The Simpsons since the very beginning, and for most of that time, almost nobody questioned the way Apu sounded. The voice itself had a strange beginning. Azaria has explained that he built Apu's accent out of an old movie. There was a comedy from the 1960s called The Party, in which a famous British actor named Peter Sellers played a man from India. To do it, Sellers wore makeup to make his skin look darker, a thing now seen as deeply wrong, and he put on a thick, exaggerated accent. When Azaria needed a voice for the little shopkeeper in Springfield, he reached back for that old performance and copied the feel of it. At the time, in 1990, it did not seem like a big deal to anyone in the room. It seemed like one more funny voice among many. Years passed. The show got bigger than anyone had ever imagined a cartoon could get, and as the world changed, the way people looked at Apu changed too. For many children of Indian families growing up in America, Apu was not just a cartoon. He was, for a long stretch of time, one of the only people who looked anything like them on a popular show. That fact gave the character a weight that the writers had probably never planned for. When a whole group of people almost never sees themselves on screen, the one version that does exist starts to stand in for all of them, whether anyone wants it to or not. In 2017, a comedian named Hari Kondabolu put that feeling into a film. Kondabolu grew up in America in an Indian family, and he loved The Simpsons. He was also someone who had spent his whole life hearing the Apu voice thrown back at him, used as a way to tease him, mock him, and make him feel small. He made a documentary, a kind of movie that looks at a real subject, and he called it The Problem with Apu. In it, he laid out a careful argument. The character, he said, was not just a harmless joke. It was a flat cartoon idea of what an entire group of people was supposedly like, an idea built almost entirely out of an accent and a corner corner store. And worse, it had handed bullies a tool. Kids across the country were getting the Apu voice shouted at them in hallways, on playgrounds, and on the street. The film did something that years of quiet grumbling never had. It put the question right in front of the show and would not let it disappear. Plenty of people watched it and felt that Kondabolu had named something true that they had never quite been able to explain. Others felt he was making too much of a cartoon. The argument spilled out across the internet, onto talk shows, and into the kind of long conversations that do not resolve in an afternoon. The Simpsons did respond, though the way it chose to respond made a lot of people even more upset. In a 2018 episode called No Good Read Goes Unpunished, the show worked the whole argument into the story. Marge sits reading an old children's book to Lisa, except the book has been quietly rewritten to take out the parts that would bother people today. Lisa then turns and speaks straight to the audience watching at home. She says that something which began long ago and was once thought of as harmless, even something people had clapped for, has now somehow become wrong. She glances toward a framed photo of Apu sitting nearby. Marge adds that some things will simply be dealt with later on. That scene landed badly. To Kondabolu and to many viewers, it felt like the show had heard a serious worry and answered it with a shrug. Rather than taking the argument apart or facing it head-on, the writers seemed to suggest that the people raising the issue were being silly, fussy, and out of step with the past. The message many took away was that the show did not really want to change and did not really think it had to. The fight, instead of calming down, got loud. Behind the scenes, the people who made the show were stuck. By Azaria's own account, the whole team froze. Nobody knew what the right move was, and so for a long while, the simplest choice won out by default. Apu just stopped talking. Episodes went by where he might appear in the background, but the writers stopped giving him lines. The voice that had been part of Springfield for almost 3 decades quietly went silent, while everyone tried to figure out what to do with it. For Azaria, the question turned into something he could not put down. He has said that he expected at first to look into the whole matter, decide it was being blown out of proportion, and then go right back to doing the voice with a clear conscience. That is not where he ended up. The more he sat with it, the more he came to believe that he had been part of something that caused real harm. The piece that weighed on him most was simple and hard to argue away. When South Asian people in America were attacked, robbed, or insulted, the name they were often called as an insult was Apu. A character meant to make people laugh had been turned into a slur, a word used to wound. Azaria decided he no longer wanted his work to be part of that. There was another thought that pushed him as well. He pointed out that for around 20 years, Apu had been just about the only major South Asian character in American popular culture at that level of fame. He was not one face among many. He was, for a long time, close to the only one. That meant the character carried far more than a single cartoon usually has to carry. Azaria put it plainly in his own way, saying that while Apu might seem like a small thing, he was a window into something much bigger. Early in 2020, Azaria made it official. He said he would no longer voice Apu. He apologized, and he made a point of saying that he wished he had stepped away sooner. He was careful, too, not to paint himself as some kind of hero. By his own telling, he had been pulled into the whole thing rather than rushing toward it, and he had a real choice to make in public about what kind of work he was willing to keep doing. Not everyone agreed with how it all played out, and the show's history gives those people a fair point to stand on. A question that came up again and again was about the other voices Azaria does. He still plays Luigi, a character built on a thick, silly Italian accent. He still plays Cletus, a country character built on a thick, rural drawl. So why, people asked, was one funny voice fine while another was not? Azaria has answered that himself, and his answer is the heart of the whole matter. The difference, he said, was that the Apu version had crossed out of the screen and into real life, where it was being used to hurt actual people. A joke that stays a joke is one thing. A joke that becomes a weapon someone shouts at a stranger on the street is another. That, in his view, was the line. The strange result of all this is that Apu, a character with a wife, 8 children, a shop, and decades of stories, has not spoken a single word on the show since. He has not been killed off. He has not been written out with some big goodbye. He simply stands quiet, a familiar shape in a familiar place, no longer allowed to say anything. The people who run the show have not said clearly whether he will ever come back with a new actor. Perhaps someone of South Asian background around who could take the part in a different direction. For now, the door is neither open nor shut. It just hangs there. What makes the whole episode worth sitting with is how slow it all was. None of this happened in a single dramatic moment. A voice was created in 1990 in a casual afternoon, copied from an old film, with no real thought about what it might mean. It ran for almost 30 years while the world quietly shifted underneath it. A comedian spent his own life carrying the weight of it before he finally made a film about it. A show that prided itself on never being afraid of anything found that, this time, it had no easy joke to reach for. And a man who had given that voice for most of his adult life had to decide, in front of everyone, whether to keep doing something he had always thought was fine. The Apu story is really a story about time, about how something can sit harmless in one moment and turn heavy in another, without the thing itself ever changing. The character on the screen in 2018 was drawn exactly the same as the character on the screen in 1990. Every line was the same. The accent was the same. What changed was the world around him and the patience of the people he was supposed to be standing in for. The shop never moved. The lights over the old hot dogs never went out. But the voice behind the counter, after almost 3 decades of never running out of things to say, finally had nothing left that it was allowed to say at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And here is the part that connects this to everything that comes next. The trouble with Apu was about a voice the show could no longer bring itself to use. The very next chapter of this story is about something far stranger. Once, The Simpsons made an episode built around the most famous musician alive at the time, a man whose presence was such a secret that the show would not even admit he was in it. For years, it was treasured as one of the best things the show had ever made. Then, all at once, the people who made it decided that the safest thing to do was to take that episode and act as if it had never existed at all. Section 2. The episode they erased. In the early years of The Simpsons, the show pulled off a trick that almost no other program could manage. It got famous people to come on and play themselves, or play made-up characters, and it made those visits feel like a treat rather than a gimmick. A movie star would lend their voice for an afternoon. The writers would build a clever little story around them, and the result would slot neatly into Springfield as if it had always belonged there. But one of these guest visits was bigger, stranger, and more tightly guarded than any that came before or after. It came at the very start of the 3rd season, in an episode that first aired in September of 1991, and it carried the voice of the most famous musician on the planet at that exact moment in time. The episode was called Stark Raving Dad. The story begins with a small accident at home. Bart leaves his lucky red cap mixed in with a load of white laundry, and so when the wash is done, every one of Homer's work shirts has turned a soft shade of pink. Homer, having nothing else clean, wears one of the pink shirts to his job at the power plant. His boss, Mr. Burns, takes one look at a man in a pink shirt and decides this is the sign of some kind of dangerous free thinker, somebody who refuses to follow the rules. Homer is handed a test meant to measure whether his mind is sound. He does not bother filling it out himself. He lets Bart scribble in answers at random, ticking every box without reading a single question. The test comes back looking like the work of a madman, and Homer is promptly carted off to a mental hospital. It is inside that hospital that the famous moment happens. Homer is placed in a room with another patient, a large, bald, heavy-set man. This man speaks in a soft, gentle, high voice, and he calmly explains that he is, in fact, Michael Jackson. He believes it completely. He acts it out. He sings, and he carries himself like a global superstar trapped in an ordinary man's body. Homer, who does not really follow music and does not question much of anything, simply accepts this at face value and becomes the man's friend. The character's real name, it later turns out, is Leon Kompowski, a bricklayer who had spent his life feeling invisible and angry until he started speaking in that gentle voice and found that it made people happy. Now here is the secret that sat at the center of the whole thing. The patient who believed he was Michael Jackson was actually voiced by Michael Jackson, the real one. The singer was a fan of the show and wanted to take part, and so he came in and recorded the role himself. But there was a tangle of rules around his involvement, tied to the contracts he had with his record company, and because because of those rules, he could not be openly credited for the work. So the show did something almost playful with the secret. They hid it in plain sight. They listed a different name in the credits. They let the world wonder. For a long time, that wondering was half the fun. People argued about whether it was truly him. The voice sounded right, but stars had voice doubles, and the show would not confirm anything. Even Matt Groening, the man who created The Simpsons, played along when he went on a late-night talk show. He hinted hard that it was really Jackson. He winked at the truth, but he would not come right out and say it. The mystery became part of the legend of the episode. There was even a sly little clue dropped into a later episode, where Lisa mentions that Jackson and another famous actor had both made secret appearances in a movie, adding that they had not used their real names, but you could tell it was them. The show was practically grinning at its own hidden joke. There was a second reason this episode mattered so much to fans, separate from the mystery of the voice. The story is, at its heart, sweet. The man who thinks he is Michael Jackson is not really mocked. He is a lonely person who has found a kind of gentleness inside himself, and the show treats that with care. Near the end, the patient helps Bart with a problem. Bart has forgotten his little sister Lisa's birthday and has nothing to give her, and the two of them sit down together and write Lisa a song. It is a simple, tender thing, a birthday song made just for her, and it became one of the most quietly loved moments in the whole early run of the show. For years, Stark Raving Dad sat near the top of fans' lists of favorite episodes. It had everything: a clever setup, a famous secret, real warmth, and an original song people actually remembered. Then, many years later, all of that came undone in a matter of days. Michael Jackson had been followed for a long time by serious accusations. People had claimed, going back to the 1990s, that he had badly hurt children. There had been settlements and a trial, and in 2005, he was found not guilty in a court of law. After he died in 2009, much of the public chose to set the accusations aside and remember the music. The questions did not vanish, but they faded into the background for a lot of people, and the songs kept playing. In early 2019, a documentary changed that. It was a long, careful film made for television, and it was called Leaving Neverland. In it, two men sat down and told their stories in slow, painful detail. They said that Jackson had sexually abused them when they were boys. The film did not rush. It let the two men speak at length, and it laid out their accounts with a quiet, heavy weight that many viewers found impossible to shake off. When it aired, it pulled the old accusations back into the bright center of public attention, and this time, the reaction was different. Radio stations stopped playing his songs. People who had spent years separating the man from the music suddenly found that they could not. The people who run The Simpsons watched it too, and among them was James L. Brooks, one of the show's founding figures, a man who had been there from the start. Brooks has said that he went into the documentary actually hoping to come out of it still believing in Jackson's innocence. That is not what happened. He found the film convincing, and he found it heartbreaking. Once he had seen it, the choice in front of him became clear in a way that surprised even him. He talked it over with the other men he had spent his life making the show with, the people he described as spending their whole lives arguing over jokes, and on this, they did not argue at all. They were all of one mind. They decided to pull Stark Raving Dad, not edit it, not add a warning to it, remove it entirely. The episode would be taken out of the reruns that air on television. It would be stripped from the on-demand service where fans could watch any episode they liked, and it would be cut from future copies of the show on disc. For a series that had made hundreds and hundreds of episodes over 30 years, this was something brand new. The Simpsons had never once erased one of its own. Brooks explained the decision in a way that has stuck with people ever since. He admitted plainly how much the episode meant to him and to the team. He said there were a lot of great memories wrapped up in that one, and that this choice did not let those memories stay. Then he said the thing that really captured the strangeness of it all. He said that he was against the burning of books of any kind, but, he added, this was their book, and they were allowed to take out a chapter. That image of a creator quietly tearing one page out of his own long story is what makes this whole event linger in the mind. The show was not being forced by anyone. No law made them do it. They chose it on their own because they decided they could no longer be comfortable with what the episode now carried. The other showrunner, Al Jean, put the discomfort into sharper words. He pointed out that Jackson, by lending his voice to one of the most popular shows on Earth, could have been using the appearance to reach and win over young viewers in a way that now looked deeply troubling. Once you saw the episode through that lens, the sweetness curdled. The gentle voice in the hospital room was no longer just a charming secret. It was a famous man, accused of terrible things, sitting at the heart of a children's cartoon. So the episode went away. If you grew up watching The Simpsons over and over, you may have a strange experience now. You can find almost every episode the show has ever made lined up neatly in order, ready to play. But there is a gap. The opening of the third season is simply missing, like a single book pulled from a long shelf, leaving a thin, empty space where it used to stand. The birthday song, the pink shirt, the bald man with the soft voice, all of it sits in a kind of locked drawer that the show decided not to open again. There is something quietly remarkable in how completely the meaning of that episode flipped. When it first aired, the hidden voice was a delicious secret, a thing fans were proud to know about and loved to argue over. The whole appeal was that something wonderful was tucked inside, just out of sight, waiting to be discovered. Decades later, the exact same hidden thing became the reason the whole episode had to vanish. The secret did not change. Not one frame of the cartoon was different. What changed was what the world had learned about the man behind the voice. And once that knowledge arrived, there was no way to watch the old episode the same way again. It also says something about how The Simpsons sees itself. For most of its life, the show acted as if nothing was too sacred to joke about, and nothing was off limits. It mocked presidents, religions, whole countries, and itself. The idea that it would ever quietly remove one of its own creations, out of care for people it had never met, did not fit the picture most fans had of it. And yet, that is exactly what it did. Faced with a choice between protecting a beloved memory and stepping away from a man now tied to real suffering, the people in charge chose to let the memory go. The pink shirt still turned pink. The test was still filled in wrong. Homer still ended up in that hospital room, still made a friend, still helped his son write a little song for a little girl's birthday. All of it still happened, somewhere, in a version of the show that simply is not shown anymore. The episode exists and does not exist at the same time, treasured by the people who remember it and quietly denied by the show that made it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The story of Apu was about a voice the show could no longer bring itself to use. The story of Stark Raving Dad was about an entire episode the show chose to bury. Both came down to the same hard truth, that the meaning of a thing can change long after the thing itself is finished. But not every controversy in the show's history grew out of something dark or painful behind the scenes. Some of them came from nothing more than the writers being careless, reaching for an easy joke about a place they had never been, and accidentally picking a fight with a whole country. The next chapter is about the time The Simpsons made fun of an entire nation, and that nation got angry enough to threaten the show in a court of law. Section 3. The Country That Fought Back. The Simpsons loved to send its family on trips. Over the years, The Simpsons packed their bags and flew off to all sorts of faraway places, dropping into one country after another and getting into trouble wherever they landed. These travel episodes followed a simple recipe. Take the family, drop them somewhere new, and let the jokes come from the gap between what they expect and what they find. Most of the time, the country being visited took it in good humor. A nation would see itself poked at by a cartoon, roll its eyes, maybe laugh, and move on. But in the spring of 2002, the show picked a destination that did not laugh. It picked Brazil, and Brazil fought back, hard enough to drag the whole thing toward a courtroom. The episode was the 15th one of the 13th season, and it was called Blame It on Lisa. It first aired at the end of March in 2002, and a large audience tuned in to watch it, somewhere around 11 million homes. The story starts small. The family discovers a giant phone bill, hundreds of dollars worth of calls made to Brazil. It turns out Lisa is behind it. She has been sending money to support a poor orphan boy down in Brazil named Ronaldo, and she has been calling to stay in touch with him. Then the letters from Ronaldo stop coming. Lisa calls the orphanage and learns that the boy has gone missing. Worried sick about the child she has been helping, Lisa convinces the family to fly all the way to Brazil to find him. They leave the baby, Maggie, with the ants, and off they go to the city of Rio de Janeiro. That is where the trouble started, and the trouble was in the details. The Brazil the family arrives in is a cartoon nightmare version of the real place. The streets are crawling with monkeys, as if the whole city were a jungle. There are rats everywhere. Children swarm the family on the beach, begging and stealing. A taxi driver turns out to be a kidnapper, and he snatches Homer right off the street and holds him for ransom deep in the rainforest. To get the money to free Homer, the family has to scramble through a city shown as dangerous, filthy, and chaotic at every turn. A children's television host on a show the family watches dances around in revealing outfits in a way that felt aimed straight at a real and beloved entertainer in Brazil. The picture the episode painted was of a place where you could be robbed, grabbed, or swallowed by a giant snake at any moment, surrounded by poverty and animals. On top of all that, the show got its basic facts about the country wrong in ways that stung. The people of Brazil speak Portuguese. The episode had Brazilians speaking with Spanish accents, mixed in bits of broader Latin American flavor that had nothing to do with Brazil in particular, and even leaned on a moment where Bart proudly learns Spanish to get ready for the trip, only to be told that the country speaks Portuguese instead. To people who actually lived there, it felt less like a joke and more like the show could not be bothered to tell their country apart from any other. The whole place had been flattened into a lazy stack of cliches about danger and poverty, with the real culture scraped away. Now, the timing of all this could hardly have been worse for keeping the peace. At that exact moment, the city of Rio de Janeiro was pouring enormous effort into bringing in visitors from around the world. There was an official tourism board for the city, a group whose entire job was to make Rio look appealing to travelers. That board had spent something close to $18 million over a stretch of about 3 years on a campaign to draw tourists in. They were working hard to sell the world an image of a beautiful, exciting, welcoming city. And then one of the most watched shows on the planet beamed out a half hour of monkeys, rats, kidnappers, and slums, all wearing the name of their city. To the tourism board, this was not a harmless gag. It was a direct hit on something they had spent years and a fortune building. So they did something the show was not used to. They got angry in an official way, and they started talking about suing. The head of the Rio Tourism Board had his legal team look into what could be done. The board announced plans to take Fox, the company behind the show, to court over the damage they believed the episode had done to the city's good name. This was not a few annoyed viewers writing letters. This was a city government weighing a real lawsuit against a cartoon, claiming that a single episode had threatened the livelihood of a place that depended on visitors. The anger did not stop at the tourism board either. The story climbed all the way up to the top of the country. The president of Brazil at the time spoke out about it. He complained that the episode had carried a twisted, false picture of Brazilian life out to the whole world. When the leader of a nation is publicly upset about how your cartoon drew his country, you have officially stepped past the usual fun and games of a travel episode. Brazilian newspapers piled on as well, pointing out, fairly, that many of the jokes were so sloppy they were not even really about Brazil. They were just generic gags about the whole continent, slapped onto one specific country that happened to be in the way. The show's response to all of this was a careful mix of an apology and a joke, which fit The Simpsons perfectly. James L. Brooks, one of the founding figures of the show, put out a statement on behalf of the producers. He said, with what sounded like real politeness, that they apologized to the lovely city and people of Rio de Janeiro. That was the serious part. Then, because this was The Simpsons, he could not quite leave it there. He added that if the apology did not settle things, then Homer Simpson would be happy to fight the president of Brazil in a celebrity boxing match. It was a strange little olive branch, half sorry and half daring the country to keep being mad. The studio also pointed out something that probably made the writers feel less guilty than they should have. They told reporters that they had made fun of plenty of other countries before this, and none of those countries had come after them anywhere near this hard. From the show's point of view, Brazil was the one that had overreacted. The man who ran the show, Al Jean, said as much in his own way. He noted that every other place they had mocked had shown a good sense of humor about it. Brazil, he said, caught them by surprise. The unspoken idea there is a little cheeky. It suggests the problem was not that the jokes were cruel, but that Brazil was the first country thin-skinned enough to truly object. That is a comfortable story to tell yourself, and it conveniently skips over the question of whether the jokes had simply gone too far this time. In the end, the lawsuit did not actually happen. The tourism board explored it. The threat hung in the air for a while, but the legal fight fizzled out after the apology. The board president, by some accounts, eventually got over it and let the matter drop. When the episode finally aired in Brazil itself later that year, it came with a little note tacked onto the front, making sure everyone understood that the network was not responsible for the vision of the people who had made the episode. In other words, do not blame us for what these writers cooked up. But here is the part that shows the show's true character. The producers may have apologized in public, but the writers themselves clearly did not feel all that sorry. Instead of quietly dropping the whole sore subject, they turned the complaint into a long-running joke. One specific thing had bothered the Brazilians more than anything else. A spokesman for the tourism board had said that what really hurt was the image of the monkeys, the suggestion that Rio de Janeiro was some kind of jungle. The writers heard that, and rather than backing away from it, they leaned in. In a later episode, Homer makes a passing crack about the monkey problem in Rio getting worse. In another, the show reveals that Krusty the Clown's little monkey sidekick is from Brazil, and even jokes that the monkey's uncle held a top job at the Brazilian tourism office. They took the exact complaint that had nearly landed them in court and quietly stitched it into the background of the show like a private dare, daring anyone to come after them again. Because of all the heat it brought, Blame It on Lisa became an episode the show rarely showed. It got aired only a handful of times before it more or less went quiet, slipping out of the regular rotation and taking a long while to drift back into reruns. It earned a reputation as one of the show's most troublesome trips, the time a quick laugh about a faraway place nearly turned into an international mess. What makes this whole event different from the earlier ones is where the harm came from. The Apu trouble grew out of a voice that meant something deep to a group of people. The Michael Jackson episode was buried because of dark things tied to a real man. Those were heavy, complicated stories about people and pain. The Brazil mess was simpler and, in a way, more embarrassing. It came from carelessness. The writers wanted a fun travel episode. They reached for the easiest, broadest jokes they could find about a place they did not really know, and they could not even be bothered to get the language right. The damage was not born from cruelty so much as from not caring enough to look closely, and it turned out that a whole country could feel that lack of care, take real offense at it, and push back with the threat of a courtroom. There is a quiet lesson tucked inside the Brazil affair, one the show seemed to half learn. When you make fun of something you understand, the joke can land like a friendly jab between equals. When you make fun of something you have not bothered to learn the first thing about, the joke stops being a jab and starts feeling like an insult. The people of Rio could tell the difference. They could feel that the show had not done its homework, that it was laughing at a cartoon idea of their home rather than the home itself. That is what stung. Years later, the family did return to Brazil in another episode, and that time the writers were noticeably more careful, mixing the jokes with real beauty and showing they had actually thought about the place. The lesson, it seemed, eventually sank in, even if it took a near lawsuit to teach it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. So far, these stories have all involved the show clashing with the outside world, with groups of people, with the memory of a famous man, with an entire country. Each fight came from somewhere beyond the cartoon itself, but the next chapter turns inward. The next storm The Simpsons walked into was one of its own making, set entirely inside Springfield, built around a single character that fans had known and trusted for years. It did not anger a nation or a community. It simply broke something the audience held dear, took a person they thought they understood, and revealed that he had been someone else all along. Section 4. The Man Who Was Not Himself. Springfield Elementary School had a principal, and everyone knew him. His name was Seymour Skinner. He was stiff, fussy, and rule-bound, a man who walked the halls in a tight suit with a tight expression, forever trying and forever failing to keep order in a school that ran on chaos. He was a former soldier who had served in the Vietnam War, and he carried that part of his past everywhere, in his posture, in his love of discipline, in the way he barked when things slipped out of line. He still lived with his sharp-tongued mother, Agnes, who treated him like a child no matter how old he got. He had a soft soft, doomed crush on a teacher named Edna. He had been Bart's main enemy at school for years, the grown-up who could never quite catch the boy who tormented him. By the 9th season, fans had spent 8 years with this man. They had watched him get fired and rehired. They had watched his strange, sad little life with his mother. They had seen him fall for Edna and seen it never quite work out. There was even a whole earlier episode built around him, a deep and careful look at who he was. Skinner was not the star of the show, nowhere close, but he was a solid, familiar piece of the furniture. People felt they knew him. They had built up years of feeling about this uptight, lonely, oddly likable principal. That feeling, that long, slow trust, is the thing the show was about to set on fire. The episode was called The Principal and the Pauper. It was the second episode of the 9th season, and it opened in the most ordinary way possible. The town gathers to celebrate Skinner's 20th anniversary as principal. It is a warm little event, the kind of thing that should run for a few minutes and end with a joke. Then the door opens and a stranger walks in. He is an older man and he announces something that makes no sense at first. He says that he is the real Seymour Skinner. He says the man everyone has been calling Skinner for 20 years is a fake. And then the cartoon does something that fans never saw coming. The principal admits it. He confesses that the stranger is telling the truth. The man Springfield knew as Seymour Skinner is not Seymour Skinner at all. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. The story he tells unspools from there. Armin Tamzarian, it turns out, was a troublemaking young man from a city far away, the kind of kid who got into trouble with the law. A judge gave him a choice, and Armin ended up going off to serve in the Vietnam War. There, he met a sergeant named Seymour Skinner, a good and decent man who took the rough young Armin under his wing and gave his life some shape and purpose. Armin came to look up to this sergeant like a hero. Then the sergeant went missing in the war and was believed dead. Armin traveled to Springfield to break the sad news to the dead man's mother, Agnes. But when Agnes saw him, in her grief, she mistook Armin for her own son, Seymour. And Armin, unable to bring himself to crush her with the truth, simply let her believe it. He stepped into the dead man's life. He took his name, his mother, and eventually his dream of becoming a school principal. He had been living as Seymour Skinner ever since. It was a wild, sweeping change to a character people thought they understood completely. Everything fans knew about Skinner, every bit of his past, his mother, his soldier's pride, all of it was suddenly built on a swapped identity. And the way the episode ended only made things worse for many viewers. The real Seymour Skinner, the actual sergeant, was not dead after all. He came back. But the town of Springfield discovered that they did not much like the real Skinner. He was prickly and unpleasant in his own way, and people had grown comfortable with the fake one. So the town made a choice that was almost shocking in its coldness. They decided they preferred the imposter. They literally ran the real Skinner out of town, tying him to a chair on a train car and shipping him away. Then a judge declared that from that moment on, Armin Tamzarian would be called Seymour Skinner again, would go back to his job, and that no one was ever to speak of any of this again under threat of punishment. With that, the show hit a giant reset button and pretended the whole thing had never happened. The reaction from fans was not quiet. Many of them hated it. They felt cheated, as if the show had reached into 8 years of their feeling for this character and thrown it all in the trash for the sake of a single throwaway story. The complaint that came up again and again was about that very thing. You do not take a person an audience has spent years caring about and reveal, out of nowhere, that none of it was real. It felt arbitrary, like a stunt done just because the writers could, with no good reason behind it. To a lot of viewers, this episode became a kind of marker, the spot where they would later point and say that this was the moment the show began to lose its way, the end of its finest run. The anger was not only out among the fans, it reached inside the show itself, all the way to the people who had built it. The man who created The Simpsons, Matt Groening, has named this as one of his least favorite episodes, and the actor who gave Skinner his voice, Harry Shearer, the same man who voices Mr. Burns and Ned Flanders and many others, openly hated it. Shearer remembered reading the script and telling the writers, flat out, that it was wrong. He said they were taking something an audience had built years of investment in and tossing it away for no good reason, for a story the show had basically done before with other characters. He called it arbitrary, pointless, and disrespectful to the very people watching. It is a rare and striking thing for the actor playing a a part to publicly say that the story he was hired to perform was an insult to the fans. But there is another side to this, and it is worth understanding, because the writer who made the episode has defended it for years, and his defense is genuinely clever. The episode was written by a man named Ken Keeler, who is, by any measure, brilliant. He holds a high degree in mathematics from one of the top schools in the world, and he was responsible for many of the smartest jokes ever slipped into the show. He did not stumble into this story by accident. He built it on purpose, and he had a point he was trying to make. Keeler has explained that the episode is really about a group of people who like things exactly the way they are. Skinner, to the town, is a minor figure they do not truly know well, but the moment someone walks in and says this is not really how things are, that the man you trust is not who you think, the town gets furious. They do not want the comfortable picture disturbed, so they attack the messenger, the real Skinner, and they run him out of town to protect the version of reality they prefer. They would rather keep a comfortable lie than accept an uncomfortable truth. And then the real world did something almost too perfect. When the episode aired, a group of people who liked things exactly the way they were got furious. The fans, attached to their comfortable picture of Skinner, reacted with the same anger the cartoon town had shown. Keeler has pointed this out with a kind of quiet amusement. He has said that it never seemed to occur to anyone that the episode is about the people who hate it. The story was a mirror, and the audience that smashed it was the very thing it was holding up a reflection of. According to that reading, the people most upset by the episode were unknowingly proving its point. Whether that defense fully holds up is something fans still argue about. Some find it a smart, almost sneaky bit of storytelling, a cartoon quietly predicting and even mocking its own backlash before the backlash arrived. Others think it is a clever excuse stretched over a story that simply did not work, a fancy way of saying that the people who disliked it were wrong, rather than facing the chance that the episode itself was the problem. There is no settled answer. The argument is part of why the episode refuses to fade away. What is certain is that the show never let the moment go. The writers seemed fully aware of how much trouble they had stirred, and rather than hiding from it, they joked about it for years afterward. In one later episode, a clip from The Principal and the Pauper is shown as an example of the show leaning on silly, nonsense plots. In another, Lisa, while dealing with a string of replacement cats and quietly pretending the dead ones never existed, gets a little nudge from Skinner about how that is a cheat. She turns and calls him Principal Tamzarian, dropping his hidden name like a small, sharp pin. The show was poking fun at its own most hated story, winking at the audience that the writers had not forgotten the mess and were happy to keep teasing it. Over time, the strangest thing happened to the episode. The rest of the show quietly decided it had never been true. Later episodes went right back to treating Skinner as if he had always been the real Seymour Skinner, born to Agnes, with no Armin Tamzarian anywhere in sight. There are scenes showing Agnes pregnant with him, scenes of him as a small boy growing up with his mother, all of it ignoring the swapped identity completely. The show effectively used its own reset button for real, folding the whole controversial story into a drawer and acting, in every episode that followed, as though it had simply never been opened. That is the odd ghost this episode left behind. For 1/2 hour, the show told you that a character you trusted was a stranger wearing a dead man's life. Then it told you to forget it ever said that. And then it spent the next many years actually forgetting, on screen, in front of you. The story exists fully in that one episode, and it does not exist at all in the version of Springfield the show has chosen to keep. Skinner is Skinner again, the way he always was, except now there is a quiet little crack in the wall, a name, Armin Tamzarian, that fans will never let anyone forget. What ties this back to everything before it is the idea of trust. The audience had trusted the show with this character, the way you trust a long story to play fair with you, and the show had taken that trust and bent it for a single episode. The fans felt that bend in their gut, and they reacted. And the show argued that their reaction was the whole point. It was a fight not with a country or a community, but with the bond between a show and the people who love it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Up to now, every controversy has lived inside the world of the show, in its episodes and its characters and the people who made them. But the next chapter steps out of the cartoon entirely and into the recording booth. It is about the actors themselves, the small handful of people who give voice to nearly everyone in Springfield, and a decision the show made about who should be allowed to speak for whom. It is a choice that split the cast, drew an angry response from one of its longest-serving members, and changed the sound of the town for good. Section 5. Who gets to speak? There is a strange secret hiding behind the town of Springfield. It holds hundreds of people. There is the family, the school staff, the workers at the power plant, the police, the doctors, the bartender, the shopkeeper, the news anchor, the bully, the reverend, and on and on. But the voices for almost all of those people come from a tiny group of actors. A handful of performers, fewer than you have fingers on two hands, give life to that entire crowd. One actor might play a dozen characters or more, switching between them so smoothly that you never stop to think about it. The town sounds full and varied, but it is really a small room of very talented people doing a great many voices. For most of the show's history, nobody thought twice about which actor played which character. The job was simply to be able to do the voice. If you could make a character sound right, the part was yours, and it did not matter who you were underneath. Two of the show's main voice actors, Hank Azaria and Harry Shearer, between them carried a huge slice of the town. Azaria, as we have already seen, voiced Apu, but he voiced far more than that. He also gave the voice to Carl, one of Homer's friends at the power plant, a black man. He voiced a police officer named Lou, also black. He voiced the Bumblebee Man, a character from a Spanish-language television show. Harry Shearer, for his part, voiced Dr. Hibbert, the cheerful town doctor with the warm chuckle, who was drawn as a black man. So you had a situation, built up quietly over decades, where white actors were the voices of many of the town's non-white characters. It had always been that way. It was just how the show worked, and almost no one questioned it. But the world outside the recording booth was beginning to ask harder questions about who plays whom and why, and whether it matters. The trouble with Apu had already cracked the door open on this. Once people started asking whether it was right for a white actor to voice a character like Apu, it was only a matter of time before the same question spread to all the others. The push reached a tipping point in the summer of 2020. That was a time of enormous conversation across the country about race and fairness, a moment when many people were looking hard at old habits and asking whether they should change. In the middle of all that, the people who run The Simpsons made an announcement that was short and clear. Moving forward, they said, the show would no longer have white actors voice non-white characters. With that one sentence, a rule that had governed the show silently for 30 years was thrown out, and a new one took its place. The change was not just words. It meant real people losing parts they had played for ages, and real new people stepping in. The first to go was Carl. When the new season began, a black actor named Alex Desert took over the role of Carl from Hank Azaria. The same actor also took on the voice of Officer Lou, the other black character Azaria had been playing. A short while later, the Bumblebee Man was handed over too, going from Azaria to a Cuban-born actor. One by one, the characters were being passed from the actors who had originated them to new performers, chosen to better match the characters on screen. The biggest single change came a little later, and it landed on Harry Shearer. Dr. Hibbert, the friendly Dr. Shearer had voiced for more than 30 years, was going to be recast. The man chosen to take over was a black actor named Kevin Michael Richardson, someone who had already done small voices on the show for years and was well known for his work on other cartoons. Shearer's final time voicing Dr. Hibbert came in an episode early in 2021. After that, the Doctor would speak with a new voice. Shearer kept all his many other roles, his Mr. Burns, his Ned Flanders, his Principal Skinner, but Hibbert was no longer his. Now, not everyone inside the show agreed with this new rule, and the disagreement became public in a way that was hard to ignore. Harry Shearer did not stay quiet about it. He spoke out, and his objection rested on a simple, old-fashioned idea about what acting even is. The whole job of an actor, he argued, is to play someone they are not. That is the entire point of pretending. An actor is not supposed to only play people exactly like themselves. They are supposed to disappear into roles, to become other people, people of different kinds and backgrounds backgrounds and lives. From where Shearer stood, telling actors they could only voice characters who shared their own background went against the very heart of the craft. He felt the show had given up something important about acting itself. Shearer also said something about Dr. Hibbert that opened a window onto how these voices got made in the first place, and it is a complicated thing to sit with. He revealed that he had based the Doctor's voice on Bill Cosby, a famous entertainer who, back when the character was created, was known as a kind of gentle, fatherly figure on television. So the voice of this black cartoon doctor had been a white actor doing an impression of a particular black television star. When the recast happened, Shearer described the tangled result in a sharp, uncomfortable way. He said the new version was a black man imitating a white man who had been imitating a certain black star. He was pointing at how knotted the whole question becomes once you start pulling on it, how a voice can be layers deep in impressions and copies, and how hard it is to say cleanly what is fair and what is not. His objection was a real one, held by a real artist who had given the show decades of his life, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms. There is a genuine argument there about freedom in acting, about the difference between pretending and stealing, about whether a voice belongs to the person who first made it sing. But there was, of course, another side, and it was just as real. The case for the change went back to that long, quiet truth about how few actors there were. For 30 years, the people speaking for the town's black and brown and immigrant characters had almost never been black or brown or immigrants themselves. The voices of those people had been performed by a small group of mostly white men. To many, that began to feel less like the magic of acting and more like a closed door, a missing chance for actors of those backgrounds to play characters who actually looked like them. The new rule was an attempt to open that door, to let those parts go to people who had been shut out of them, and to let the town's characters be voiced by people who shared something with them. The Simpsons was not alone in this. The summer of 2020 saw the same change ripple across many cartoons at once. On Family Guy, a white actor stepped away from voicing a black character, and a black performer took over. On other animated shows, the same thing happened, again and again, in a short stretch of time. White actors who had long voiced characters of color set down those roles, and new actors picked them up. The Simpsons, being the oldest and most famous of all these shows, drew the most attention, but it was part of a wider shift that swept through the world of animation all at once. There is something quietly fitting about how the show handled the moment in its own storytelling. Even before the big announcement, The Simpsons had slipped its discomfort into an episode. In one scene, Marge sits reading an old children's book that has been quietly rewritten to remove the parts that would bother people now. Lisa, beside her, speaks straight to the camera and points out how something that began long ago, something once thought harmless and even applauded, has somehow become wrong today. As she says it, her eyes drift to a framed photo of Apu nearby. Marge tells her that some things will be dealt with later on. It was the show looking directly at its own problem, half admitting it and half shrugging at it all at once. That same uneasy mix would carry right through the recasting that followed. What makes this whole chapter different from the others is that the fight was not really about a single episode or a single joke. It was about the machine behind the curtain, the actual people in the booth, and a question with no clean answer. Who gets to speak for whom? When does a performance become a costume someone should not be wearing? Is the freedom of an actor to play anyone the most important thing? Or is the chance for shut-out performers to finally play themselves more important? These are not questions a cartoon usually has to wrestle with out loud, and there is no version of the answer that leaves everyone satisfied. Shearer believed one thing, the producers believed another. Both could point to something true, and the result is a town that quietly sounds a little different now than it used to. If you watch the early seasons and then the recent ones, some of the same faces speak with new voices. Carl sounds different. The Doctor sounds different. The characters are drawn the same. They live in the same houses. They do the same jobs, but the people breathing life into them have changed. For longtime fans, it can feel like running into an old acquaintance and noticing, just slightly, that something about them is not quite the way you remembered. The change was meant to be a small act of fairness, a correction of a long habit. To some, it felt exactly like that. To others, including including one of the show's own, it felt like a loss of something they thought the show had always understood about pretending to be other people. The story of who gets to speak is one of the few controversies where the show was arguing with itself, where the divide ran right down the middle of the cast. There was no country to apologize to, no episode to bury, no community outside the studio walls. The disagreement was between the people who made the show, played out partly in public, over a question about their own work that honest people could land on opposite sides of. It is a reminder that not every storm The Simpsons walked into had a villain and a victim. Sometimes it just had two fair points pulling in opposite directions, with no way to fully honor both. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every controversy so far has been about something the show did and then had to answer for. A voice, an episode, a country, a character, a casting choice. But the show has another kind of strange fame, one that has nothing to do with offending anyone. Over the years, a wild idea took hold among fans, an idea so odd and so sticky that it has refused to die for decades. It is the belief that The Simpsons can somehow see the future, that hidden inside its old episodes are glimpses of things that had not happened yet. The next chapter steps into that legend, and it begins with a single line about a single man, spoken on the show many years before that man ever sat behind the desk it placed him at. Section 6, the show that saw tomorrow. There is a belief about The Simpsons that is spread so far and lasted so long that even people who have never watched a single full episode have heard it. The belief is that the show can see the future, that somewhere in its huge pile of old episodes are little moments, jokes, throwaway lines, and quick background gags that quietly came true years or even decades later. It has become one of the most famous things about the show, bigger in some ways than any single character. And like most legends, it is part real, part nonsense, and a lot more interesting once you take it apart and see how it actually works. The most famous example of all, the one that turned this whole idea into a worldwide legend, is about a president. The episode aired in the year 2000, near the end of the 11th season, and it was called Bart to the Future. The setup is a vision of what is to come. Bart, the troublemaking son, is shown a glimpse of his own grown-up life, and it is not a happy one. He grows up to be a broke, washed-out man living a sad sort of existence. His little sister Lisa, on the other hand, has soared. In this future, Lisa has become the president of the United States. She is shown sitting in her office, dealing with a mess, and she says a line to the people working for her. She tells them that they have inherited quite a budget crunch from President Trump. That single line, spoken in passing in the year 2000, is the seed of the entire legend. Because 16 years later, in 2016, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Suddenly, an old cartoon line about a President Trump, dropped into a story about a far-off future, looked like a crystal ball. People dug up the clip, shared it everywhere, and pointed at it as proof that The Simpsons had somehow known what was coming long before anyone else. But here is where taking it apart matters, because the truth is more clever than magic. The writer of that episode was a man named Dan Greeny, and he has explained exactly why the joke was written the way it was. Back in the year 2000, Donald Trump was already a famous, larger-than-life figure, a wealthy man, known for putting his name on tall buildings, and he had even made a brief run at politics that very year. So the idea of a President Trump was already floating around as a kind of wild, over-the-top notion. Greeny has said the line was meant as a warning, a joke about America going a little crazy. The whole point of the story was that Lisa walks into the presidency to find the country in terrible shape, broke and struggling, and the writers needed someone to blame for leaving it that way. Trump, to them, seemed like the perfect choice, the logical last stop before a country hit rock bottom. It was a punchline about the country falling apart, with Trump as the final straw. It was satire, a joke poking at where things might be headed, and the joke happened to point at a real man who, 16 years later, actually got the job. That is the key to understanding nearly all of the so-called predictions. The show did not gaze into a magic mirror. The writers were sharp, watchful people who paid close attention to the world. They picked targets that were already a little bit in the air, already half plausible, and they pushed them to a funny any extreme. Sometimes, years down the road, the world caught up to the extreme, and the old joke suddenly looked like prophecy. It was less about seeing the future and more about understanding the present so well that you could make a good guess at where it was leaning. Take the other giant example, the one about the show's own home. For most of its life, The Simpsons aired on a network owned by a company called Fox, part of a larger company started by 20th Century Fox. Back in 1998, near the end of the 9th season, there was an episode called When You Dish Upon a Star. In it, at one point, the camera shows a sign on a film studio building. The sign reads that the studio is now a part of the Walt Disney Company. At the time, it was a quick joke. Disney was a giant, the biggest fish in the entertainment ocean, and the gag was a little jab suggesting that one day Disney would gobble up everyone, even the company that made The Simpsons. Then, in late 2017, it actually happened. Disney announced it was buying a huge chunk of the very company that owned the show, in a deal worth tens of billions of dollars. The Simpsons, the show that had joked about being swallowed by Disney, was now owned by Disney for real. Fans went wild, holding the old clip up as another stunning prediction. But once again, the writers explained it plainly. The man who ran the show, Mike Scully, said it had simply been one of those moments where they needed a quick sign joke for a shot of a studio building. And the writer of the episode, a man named Rich Appel, said the only thought behind it was a vague sense that someday Disney would own everybody. There was no secret knowledge. There was just a smart, slightly cynical guess about a hungry giant made by people who understood how that world worked. The guess took nearly 20 years to come true, and when it did, it landed right on top of them. Once you understand the pattern, the legend becomes both smaller and more impressive at the same time. Smaller because it is not magic. The show cannot see tomorrow. Bigger because it shows just how many of these guesses the writers made and how often their understanding of the present was good enough to land on something real. When you make thousands and thousands of jokes over more than 30 years, and many of those jokes are sharp guesses about where the world is heading, a certain number of them are going to come true by the sheer weight of how many shots were taken. It is a bit like firing a great many arrows at a wide wall. Some are bound to hit something eventually, and those are the ones everyone remembers and shares, while the thousands that missed are quietly forgotten. And that brings up the part of this legend that needs an honest warning, because the future-seeing reputation has a dark and dishonest side too. The Simpsons became so famous for predictions that people began to fake them. As the years went on, pictures spread around the internet showing supposed Simpsons scenes that perfectly matched some recent terrible event, some disaster or shocking piece of news. Many of these were not real. They were images that someone had altered, taking a real frame from the show and changing it to make it look like the writers had foretold a tragedy. The show's true reputation for clever guessing got twisted into a tool for spreading made-up nonsense. So a person has to be careful. The genuine cases, like the Trump line and the Disney sign, are real moments from real episodes that anyone can go back and find. But for every real one, there are fakes built to fool people, riding on the back of the show's honest fame. That difference between the real guesses and the fake ones is the whole heart of this chapter. The real predictions are not spooky at all once you know the story behind them. They are proof of how closely the writers watched the world, how well they understood the way money and power and fame tend to move, and how willing they were to push an idea to its silliest possible end. A President Trump, a Disney that owns everything. These were not visions. They were the kind of guesses a very smart, slightly worried person might make about where things were drifting, dressed up as a joke. The fact that the drifting eventually arrived is what turned the jokes into legend. There is something almost touching in why this legend grew so huge in the first place. People want to believe a beloved old cartoon holds secret knowledge. It is a comforting and exciting idea that something so familiar and so silly might actually be wise, might actually know things. The show leaned into that affection without ever truly claiming the power, happy to let the fans marvel while the writers quietly knew the truth. They had not seen the future. They had just paid very close attention to the present, made a great many guesses, and lived long enough to watch a handful of them come true in front of the whole world. It is worth sitting with how rare it is for any show to last long enough for this to even be possible. A program that ran for a few years could never build this kind of legend. There would not be enough jokes jokes, enough guesses, enough time for the world to catch up to them. The future-seeing reputation is, in a strange way, a side effect of the show simply refusing to end. It has been on the air so long that its old episodes have had decades to either come true or be forgotten. The same thing that makes the show feel like it can predict tomorrow is really just the fact that it has survived so many tomorrows. Time itself did half the work, so the legend is real and it is fake, both at once, depending on which piece you pick up. The Trump line is real, the Disney sign is real, the clever understanding behind them is real, the magic is not, and the floods of altered fake images are a lie that the show never had any hand in. The honest version of the story is more interesting than the spooky one anyway. A room full of sharp writers, watching the world closely for over 30 years, firing off guess after guess, and now and then nailing one so squarely that it looked like they had peeked at the answer ahead of time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This idea that the show holds hidden meanings buried in its old episodes, waiting to be discovered years later, opens a door to something even stranger. Because fans did not stop at predictions. They began to look at the show itself, at its very story, and to wonder whether there were secret truths hidden inside it too. Not guesses about the real world, but hidden explanations for the cartoon world itself. The next chapter steps into the wildest of these fan ideas, a theory that takes one ordinary old episode and uses it to claim that nearly everything the show has done since was never really happening at all. Section 7. The Long Dream of Homer Simpson. There is a kind of fan theory that does not just add a small detail to a show. It tries to swallow the whole thing. It takes everything you have ever watched and tells you that none of it meant what you thought, that the real story was hiding underneath the entire time, and that once you see it, you can never watch the show the same way again. The Simpsons has one of these. It is dark, it is clever, and it is built on a single old episode that almost nobody thinks about. The theory says that Homer Simpson has been lying in a coma for more than 20 years, and that nearly everything the show has done since the early 1990s has been happening only inside his sleeping head. To understand the theory, you have to go back to one specific episode. It aired on the first day of April in 1993 during the 4th season, and it was called So It's Come to This. It was a clip show, which is a special kind of episode where the characters sit around and the show plays bits and pieces from older episodes, like flipping through a scrapbook of memories. To give the characters a reason to be looking back, the writers built a small story around the clips, and that small story is where the whole theory takes root. It begins as an April Fool's prank gone wrong. Bart, in the spirit of the prank-filled day, plays a trick on his father. He takes a can of Homer's beer and shakes it up violently, using a machine at a hardware store to shake it far harder than any human hand could. He puts the rigged can back and waits. When Homer finally opens it, the can does not just fizz and spray, it explodes. The blast is big enough to send Homer to the hospital, and then, while he is recovering, something even worse happens. Homer is near a vending machine, the kind that holds snacks and candy, and the heavy machine tips over and crashes down on top of him. Crushed beneath it, Homer slips into a coma. He lies there, unconscious, while his family gathers around his hospital bed and remembers all the good times, which is the excuse for showing the old clips. By the end of the episode, Homer wakes up perfectly fine and immediately goes back to his old habit of strangling Bart. Everything returns to normal. The show moves on, and almost nobody gives the episode another thought. Almost nobody, that is, until a fan online took that ordinary ending and turned it on its head. The theory came from a person posting on the internet, and the idea was simple and chilling. What if Homer never actually woke up? What if, at that exact moment in 1993, Homer fell into a coma and simply never came out of it? Under this theory, everything the show has aired since that day, every episode, every adventure, every wild story, has not been real events in Homer's life. It has all been happening inside his sleeping mind, a long, endless dream playing out in the head of a man who is lying motionless in a hospital bed, year after year, never waking. Now, a wild idea like this only catches fire if there is some evidence that seems to back it up, and the fan who came up with it pointed to a few things that are genuinely hard to wave away. The first piece is about how the show itself changed around that time. Think about the kinds of stories the show told in its early years, before this this episode. They were mostly small, ordinary, everyday things. Bart cheats on a test at school. Lisa develops a crush on her teacher. Homer worries about his job. These were the troubles of a normal, if cartoonish, family, the sort of problems real people actually have. But after this coma episode, the fan argued, the stories slowly started to get stranger and bigger and wilder. The family began going on huge, unlikely adventures. They traveled to far-off countries. They went into outer space. They tangled with monsters and impossible situations that no ordinary family would ever face. The show drifted away from the small and the real and toward the loud and the fantastic. The fans' claim is that this shift is exactly what you would expect if it were all a dream. A dream does not obey the rules of real life. A sleeping mind wanders into the impossible without blinking, stitching together strange events that would never happen while awake. So the very change that many people simply chalked up to a long-running show running out of small ideas, the fan reframed as proof. The stories got dreamlike, this theory says, because they literally became a dream. The second piece of evidence is even cleverer, and it leans on the celebrity visits the show became famous for. Over the years, a parade of real famous people appeared on The Simpsons, playing themselves or made-up characters. Under the coma theory, this is explained in a neat and eerie way. A man in a coma is not fully cut off from the world around him. People believe that those who are unconscious can sometimes still hear what is happening near them, the voices and sounds of the room they are lying in. So, the theory suggests that all those famous faces showed up in Homer's dream because, in the real world, sounds from outside were leaking into his sleeping brain. Maybe a song by a famous singer played on a radio in his hospital room, and so that singer wandered into his dream. Maybe his family, sitting by his bed, talked about a celebrity in the news, and so that celebrity appeared in the story playing out in his head. It is a tidy explanation. It takes the show's habit of grabbing real people from the real world and turns it into proof that a real world exists just outside the dream, feeding little scraps into it. There is a third piece, and it might be the strangest of all, because it reaches back to the episode that aired right before the coma. That earlier episode was called Homer the Heretic, and it has a moment in it where Homer actually talks to God. Homer, frustrated, asks God the biggest question there is. He asks what the meaning of life is. God tells him that he cannot say, that Homer will only find out when he dies. Homer, impatient as always, complains that he cannot wait that long, and God replies with a line that, at the time, was just a throwaway joke. God asks Homer if he can wait 6 months. Homer the Heretic aired in the autumn of 1992, and 6 months later, almost exactly, the coma episode aired. The fan pointed at this and asked the obvious spine-tingling question. Was that line a hidden clue? Was God, in the world of the show, quietly telling Homer that in 6 months, something would happen that would carry him to the edge between life and death, the place where you might finally learn the meaning of everything? It is the kind of detail that feels too perfect to be an accident, even though it almost certainly was. Put all three pieces together, and you have a theory that is genuinely hard to shake once you have heard it. The stories got dreamlike right after the coma. The celebrities can be explained as sounds leaking into a sleeping mind, and there is even a strange 6-month warning from God sitting in the episode just before. It hangs together with an unsettling neatness. It takes a silly, forgotten clip show and turns it into the secret hinge on which the entire series swings, suggesting that for over 20 years, the show has not been the life of a family at all, but the final, long dream of a dying man. Of course, a theory this big could not stay quiet, and eventually it reached the people who actually make the show. The man who has run The Simpsons for much of its life, Al Jean, was asked about it directly, and he shot it down. He said plainly that it was not true, and the reason he gave is worth understanding, because it is grounded in how shows actually get made. For the coma theory to be real, Jean pointed out, it would mean that all the way back in 1993, the writers would have had to assume their show was going to keep running for many, many more years to come. They would have had to plant this hidden, secret meaning deep inside an ordinary episode, like burying a trap, and then leave it there for all the writers who came after them to unknowingly build on. No one making a show in 1993 thinks like that. They were not even sure how much longer the show would last. The idea that they would secretly decide the whole future of the series in a clip show and tell no one simply does not match how the work happens. Gene placed the whole theory in a friendly little category. He called it intriguing but false. Interesting to think about, fun to turn over in your mind, and not real. And that is the honest truth of it. The coma theory is not what the writers intended. There is no secret plan. The stories got wilder for the plain and ordinary reason that a show running for decades naturally drifts toward bigger ideas as the small ones get used up. The celebrities appeared because famous guests bring in viewers and make for fun episodes. The line from God 6 months earlier was a joke that happened to line up with a later episode by pure chance, the kind of coincidence that becomes meaningful only when someone looks back and decides to connect the dots. Pull on any single thread of the theory and it comes loose. It only feels solid because all the loose threads have been gathered together and tied into a knot that looks tighter than it is. But here is the thing about a great fan theory, and the reason this one refuses to die even after the showrunner himself said it was false. A theory like this does not survive because it is true. It survives because of how it makes you feel and because of what it lets you see in the show. Once you have heard the coma theory, you cannot fully unhear it. You watch an old episode where the family does something wildly impossible, and a small voice in the back of your mind whispers, "Of course this is impossible. It is a dream." You see a famous person show up, and you think about a radio playing softly beside a hospital bed. The theory gives you a new pair of glasses, and even knowing the glasses are made up, you can still choose to put them on and see the whole show tinted a darker, sadder, stranger color. There is even something quietly beautiful tucked inside the bleakness of it, and the fan who created the theory understood this. If the theory were true, if Homer really has been dreaming all this time, then think about what he is dreaming. He is not having nightmares. He is dreaming of his family. He is dreaming of his wife, his children, his town, his friends, his foolish little adventures, and his small daily joys. A man trapped in the dark of a coma has built himself an entire warm and bustling world to live in, populated by the people he loves, going on forever. Even the person who came up with the theory pointed out this gentle side of it. Whether Homer is awake or asleep, the theory says, he is still doing exactly what he always did. He is still surrounded by his family. He is still living his life, even if that life is only happening behind his closed eyes. That is what separates this from the future-seeing legend of the last chapter. The predictions were about the show reaching out into the real world and seeming to touch things that had not happened yet. The coma theory is the opposite. It turns inward, deep inward, all the way into the mind of a single character, and asks whether the whole world of the show is real at all. One legend looks outward at tomorrow. The other looks inward at a sleeping man and wonders if there ever was a tomorrow or only an endless, looping dream. Both are fan creations, born from the same deep love and the same habit of staring at the show long enough to start seeing secrets in it. And both say something about how much people care, that they would spend this much thought picking apart a cartoon, hunting for hidden meanings in episodes the writers tossed off without a second thought. In the end, the long dream of Homer Simpson stays exactly where Al Jean placed it, in that little drawer marked intriguing but false. It is not real. The man wakes up at the end of the episode, strangles his son, and life goes on, episode after episode, for real within the world of the show. But the theory lingers anyway, a quiet ghost floating over the whole series, because it asked a question too haunting to fully let go of. It looked at a goofy clip show about a man crushed by a candy machine and dared to ask whether that was the last truly real thing that ever happened to him. The answer is no. The fun is that you can never quite stop yourself from wondering. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The coma theory tried to claim that a single episode secretly rewrote everything that came after it. That is a fan's idea, dreamed up from the outside, never meant by the people in charge. But the show has, on rare occasions, done something close to that on purpose, from the inside. There is a moment in the show's history where the writers themselves reached in and changed the rules of their own world. And when they did, an entire department of the people who actually draw the show nearly walked off the job in protest. The next chapter is about the time a secret artist was handed the opening of The Simpsons and used it to turn the camera around and show the world something the show had never wanted anyone to see. Section 8. The artist who turned the camera around. Every episode of The Simpsons opens the same way, give or take. There is a little routine the show runs through before the real story begins. Bart writes something over and over on the school chalkboard. The family rushes home from different directions, and at the very end, they all pile onto the living room couch in front of the television. That last bit, the rush to the couch, is special because it changes every single time. The show uses those few seconds to do a quick joke, a tiny burst of cleverness, and fans came to love it so much that it got its own name. They call it the couch gag. Most of the time, it is light and silly. The family might turn into balloons, or get squished flat, or land in some strange place. It is the show winking at you for a moment before settling down to business. And once, that few-second wink became one of the darkest and most talked about moments in the show's entire history. All because the people in charge handed it over to a mysterious artist nobody could even put a face to. The artist goes by a single name, Banksy, and almost everything about Banksy is a riddle. He is a street artist, the kind who creates artwork in public places, often painting clever, biting images on the sides of buildings in the dead of night. His work tends to attack the powerful, to poke at greed and unfairness, and the ugliness hiding behind comfortable lives. But the strangest thing about him is that no one knows who he actually is. He has kept his real identity a secret for his entire career. His face is unknown. His name is unknown. He is famous all over the world. His art sells for staggering amounts of money, and yet he remains a ghost, a person who exists only through the work he leaves behind. Inviting someone like that into the most famous opening sequence in television was already a bold and curious choice. The episode aired in October of 2010, near the start of the 22nd season, and it was called Money Bart. The man who ran the show at the time, Al Jean, had seen a film Banksy made and had been struck by it. The idea took shape of letting this secretive artist take over the show's opening to come in and put his own stamp on it, almost like letting a graffiti artist spray paint across the front of the show. They reached out, working through the people connected to Banksy's film, and asked if he would be interested in designing a main title sequence. He agreed, and what he handed back was nothing like the gentle little couch gags fans were used to. It starts almost normal. There are small signs of Banksy right away, his name scrawled here and there across the opening, painted onto walls like the tags real graffiti artists leave behind. But the real shock comes during the couch gag. The family sits down on the couch as always, and then the picture flickers like a screen glitching, and the camera begins to pull back. As it pulls back, you slowly realize that the cheerful family on the couch was just an image on a screen, and that screen is hanging inside a vast, grim underground room. It is a sweatshop, a dark, miserable factory deep below the ground, and it is filled with rows and rows of exhausted workers, drawn to look like Asian laborers, hunched over and slaving away to produce the very cartoon you are watching. The images get worse and stranger as the camera moves through this nightmare. The workers look beaten down and tired, some of them bandaged. There are rats scurrying around, and some of them are carrying human bones, as if people have died down there and been forgotten. In one corner, sweet little kittens are being tossed into a grinding machine, turned into stuffing for Bart Simpson dolls. A sad, sickly-looking unicorn, a magical creature reduced to a tool, is being used to punch the center holes out of Simpsons DVDs, the discs people buy to watch the show at home. It is a vision of cruelty and misery hiding behind a happy, bright cartoon. The message was about as subtle as a slap. Banksy was suggesting that all the cheerful entertainment and all the fun merchandise people buy is built on the backs of suffering workers and exploited creatures, ground up in the dark so that comfortable people far away can be amused. And the reason this stung, the reason it was not just a random dark joke, is that it pointed at something real about how the show is actually made. Here is a fact that surprises a lot of fans. The Simpsons, an American show about an American family, has had much of its actual drawing done overseas, in South Korea Korea since the very beginning, going all the way back to 1989. The way these cartoons get made, the detailed, painstaking work of drawing all the in-between frames that make the characters move smoothly, has long been sent off to studios in other countries where the work could be done for less money. This is common across American animation. The bright ideas and the scripts and the main drawings often happen in America, while the enormous, grinding labor of filling in all the frames gets shipped abroad. Banksy knew this. He said himself that the whole sequence was inspired by reports that the Simpsons characters are drawn in Seoul, the capital of South Korea. So his nightmare sweatshop was not a random fantasy. It was a dark, exaggerated finger pointed straight at the show's own behind-the-scenes arrangement. That is what made it so daring. The show let an artist use its own opening to accuse the show and the company behind it of getting rich off cheap foreign labor. It was the cartoon turning the camera around and aiming it at itself, exposing the unglamorous truth of how it gets made. For a show being beamed into millions of homes by a giant company, airing a sequence that basically called that whole system cruel and greedy was a genuinely strange and risky thing to do. Behind the scenes, it did not go smoothly. Banksy later claimed that his sequence caused real trouble inside the show. He said it led to delays, to arguments over what was allowed to be broadcast, and, most dramatically, to a threatened walkout by the animation department. In other words, the very artists who draw the show were upset enough to consider refusing to work. And Al Jean, the man who ran the show, responded to all the fuss with a dry little joke that captured the whole irony of the situation. He said something along the lines of, "This is what you get when you send your work overseas." He was making light of it, treating the rebellion as a punchline, even as it pointed at a real tension humming under the surface. The company that aired the show also stepped in and trimmed the sequence. Some parts of Banksy's original vision were considered too grim or too pointed, and they were softened or cut before it went on the air. Jean admitted that changes were made, that the version which aired was toned down from what Banksy first drew, though he said the great majority of it was kept just as the artist wanted. The original, by his own description, was even sadder than what made it to screen. There were hints that the cut pieces included even harsher images and a swipe at the powerful man who owned the company behind the show. So even this act of self-criticism had limits. The show was willing to attack itself, but only up to a point, and a careful hand made sure it did not cut too deep. Now here is the twist that makes the whole episode so much richer than it first appears, and it is the kind of irony you could not make up. Banksy created this sequence to defend exploited foreign workers, to shine a light on their supposed suffering. But the foreign workers themselves were not grateful. They were offended. The real animators in South Korea, the very people Banksy claimed to be standing up for, objected to how they had been shown. The head of the Korean studio that drew much of the show complained that the sequence was excessive and insulting. His point was sharp and fair. The grim, dungeon-like sweatshop in the cartoon made it look like Korean artists toil away in filthy, miserable conditions, when in truth, they did their work in proper, modern studios in the heart of the city. One former worker, looking back, said she simply did not understand the fuss. Yes, there were long, stressful days, especially when a deadline loomed. But on most days, she said, it was just a normal job. So the artist who set out to speak for the workers ended up being scolded by those same workers for getting them wrong. Banksy had painted a picture of their lives that they did not recognize and did not appreciate. A picture that, however well meant, treated their ordinary jobs as a horror show. The studio head even managed to get the sequence changed a little. In Banksy's first version, the cartoon workers had been drawn wearing certain hats that pinned them as a specific kind of Asian laborer, and after he complained, those were swapped out for more plain, generic caps. It is a small detail, but it shows the strange tangle of the whole thing. A famous Western artist made a grand statement about Eastern suffering, and the Easterners he was speaking for had to push back and say, "That is not us. Please stop drawing us that way." There is a deeper question hiding inside this whole event, one that thoughtful people raised at the time, and it cuts right to the bone of what the sequence actually accomplished. The dark vision aired, fans Fans gasped. Everyone talked about it for a few days. But then, the episode went right back to being a normal, light, funny episode of The Simpsons. The merchandise kept selling. The show kept getting made the same way it always had. Nothing actually changed. So some asked, what was really subverted here? What was really challenged? The show got to look brave and edgy for a moment. Banksy got to be more famous and talked about than ever. The company got attention. The audience got a thrilling little shock and then settled back into the couch. And the workers, real or imagined, got nothing at all. No wages changed. No conditions shifted. The whole machine that the sequence supposedly attacked simply rolled onward, perhaps even strengthened by the buzz. The criticism, in the end, became just another piece of entertainment, a product to be enjoyed and then forgotten, swallowed up by the very system it claimed to bite. That is the lasting puzzle of the Banksy couch gag. It was bold, it was dark, it was unlike anything the show had done before, and it pointed at a true and uncomfortable fact about how cartoons are made. But it also showed how easily even a sharp piece of criticism can be defanged, softened, and absorbed. The company trimmed it, the showrunner joked about it, the workers it defended rejected it, and the world watched, marveled, and moved on without anything being fixed. It raised its fist, and the fist was wrapped in the same comfortable entertainment it was trying to punch. Still, you have to give it this. For a few seconds, one of the most watched openings in all of television turned its gaze around and showed people something they were never supposed to think about: the unseen labor and the hidden machinery behind the bright, cheerful thing they tuned in to enjoy. Most shows would never let that happen. The Simpsons, for one strange and uncomfortable moment, did. Whether it meant anything or changed anything is a question without a clean answer, but it happened in plain sight, in the last place anyone expected, and people are still arguing about what it was really for. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. This was a controversy the show invited on purpose, opening its own doors to an outsider and letting him hold up a dark mirror. But not every brave thing the show did was about money or labor or self-criticism. There was a time, many years earlier, when The Simpsons tried to do something kind and decent, to take a gentle stand on how people treat one another, and the people in charge of deciding what could air on television tried their hardest to stop it from ever reaching a single home. The next chapter is about an episode that was nearly buried before it began, an episode that was called Unacceptable in writing, and that went on to win awards for the very thing that almost got it banned. Section 9, the episode they tried to bury. In the late 1990s, The Simpsons did something quiet and brave, and it nearly never reached anyone at all. The show had spent years being loud, rude, and fearless, mocking everything in sight. But this time, it tried to be gentle. It tried to take a kind, decent stand about how people treat one another, about fear and acceptance, and the way grown men pass their small cruelties down to their sons. And for trying to do that gentle thing, the episode was very nearly killed before it could ever air. The people whose job it was to decide what could go on television looked at it, read it line by line, and wrote in plain words that the whole thing was unacceptable. The story of how it survived anyway is one of the strangest pieces of luck in the show's history. The episode was the 15th one of the 8th season. It first aired in February of 1997, and it was called Homer's Phobia. The title is a little play on words, built out of the word that means a fear of something. The story begins, as so many do, with the family needing money and wandering into a shop. They walk into a store packed with old odds and ends, the kind of place filled with funny old signs and strange collectible junk from years gone by. Behind the counter is a warm, funny, friendly man named John. John is charming. He is full of life and laughter, and he knows everything there is to know about all the quirky old treasures in his shop. The whole family takes to him instantly. Homer, in particular, becomes fast friends with John, delighted by this cheerful new buddy who makes him laugh. The man who gave John his voice was a real and famous filmmaker named John Waters, a man known for making bold, strange, colorful movies, and a man who is, in real life, gay. That fact sits at the very center of the episode, because here is the turn the story takes. Homer is happily friends with John, completely at ease, right up until the moment Marge gently tells him something he had not noticed. John is gay, and the instant Homer learns this, his whole warm friendship friendship curdles into fear. He pulls away from John. He gets uncomfortable and cold. And worst of all, a panic takes hold of him about his own son. Homer becomes terrified that spending time around John might somehow rub off on Bart, that being near a gay man might make his boy turn out gay too. What follows is Homer making a fool of himself, driven by that silly fear. He becomes desperate to prove to himself that Bart is manly enough, and he drags the boy through a series of clumsy attempts to toughen him up. The whole point of the story, the thing the writers were quietly building, is that Homer's fear is the foolish thing, not John. The joke is always on Homer. His panic is shown to be ridiculous, small-minded, and based on nothing real. John, all the while, remains the kindest and most likable person in the whole episode, and by the end, Homer learns his lesson. He comes around. He lets go of his fear, accepts John for exactly who he is, and tells Bart to do the same. It is a warm, simple, decent little story about a man getting over his own prejudice and ending up better for it. For its time, this was genuinely new ground. This was the first episode of The Simpsons to be built entirely around gay themes, to put a gay character right at the heart of the story and treat him with real warmth rather than turning him into a cruel joke. In the 1990s, that was a rare and risky thing for any popular show to do, let alone one of the biggest shows on television. And it is exactly that newness, that risk, that nearly got the whole thing thrown in the bin. To understand what happened, you need to know about a part of television that most viewers never see. Before an episode airs, it goes through a group of people whose job is to check it over and decide what is allowed and what is not. They look for things they think might upset viewers or cross some line, and they send notes back to the writers, telling them what needs to change. For The Simpsons, these notes were usually small and easy to shrug off. Most of the time, the writers got back a tiny handful of minor complaints. One real example was simply a request to swap out a slightly rude word for a softer one, light stuff. The kind of thing the writers could fix in a minute or ignore entirely. The notes came back, the small problems got smoothed over, and the episode aired. That was the normal rhythm. Homer's phobia broke that rhythm completely. When the script for this episode went through that checking process, what came back was nothing like the usual short list of nitpicks. It came back covered in complaints, pages and pages of them. According to the people who ran the show at the time, Bill Oakley and Josh Weinstein, the notes objected to nearly every single line in the episode that had anything to do with being gay, or that even used the word gay at all. The checkers did not like the word. They did not like the subject. They did not seem to want the topic discussed on the show in any form whatsoever. The feedback ran to 3 full pages. And then, at the very bottom, came the line that has become famous among fans of the show. The final sentence declared that the entire subject and content of this episode was unacceptable for broadcast. That is an extraordinary thing to receive. The usual notes were about trimming a rude word here or there. This was a flat statement that the whole episode, top to bottom, could not be shown. There was no easy fix for that. You cannot quietly swap one word and solve a problem that says the entire thing is forbidden. The complaint was not about a line. It was about the existence of the episode itself, about the very idea of telling a warm story with a gay man at its center. The people whose job it was to guard what aired had looked at a gentle tale about overcoming prejudice and decided it should never reach a single living room. Faced with that, the showrunners had a choice. They could fold, drop the episode, and move on to something safer, or they could push forward anyway and dare the whole thing to play out. Oakley and Weinstein chose to push forward. They kept making the episode. They did make one small change along the way, and it is a telling one. There was a moment where Homer, in his fear, was going to use a harsh, ugly slur to insult John, one of the cruelest words you can throw at a gay man. The team actually asked John Waters himself, the gay filmmaker voicing the character, whether he thought the gay community would find the episode offensive, and Waters said the episode was fine. His one objection was that single harsh slur, so they changed it. They swapped that ugliest word for a milder one. With that small fix made, on the advice of the very person the episode was about honoring, they kept going, refusing to let the broader objections stop them. And then came the luck, the kind of luck that decides history by accident. The episode, after after the writing was done, went off to be drawn, much of that drawing happening overseas in South Korea, as the show's work so often did. Drawing a cartoon episode takes a long time. Months can pass between finishing the script and getting the finished animated episode back. And in that stretch of time, while Homer's phobia was being drawn far away, something changed at the very top of the company. The president of the network, the powerful person at the head of it all, was fired, gone. And when a leader at the top falls, the people under them often go too. The group of checkers who had declared the episode unacceptable were swept out along with the old boss. New people came in. By the time the finished episode came back from being drawn, the very people who had tried to kill it were no longer there to stop it. The objection had simply evaporated. There was no one left holding the line they had drawn. And so the episode that had been called unacceptable for broadcast quietly went on the air. What happened next is the sweetest part of the whole story, the part that turns it from a near miss into a triumph. The episode that had been branded too shameful to show did not just survive, it was celebrated. It won awards, real and serious ones. It took home a top prize for the best animated program, and, most fittingly of all, it was honored by a major group that works to support and fairly represent gay people in the media. That group gave the episode an award and praised it warmly, calling it a shining example of how to bring smart, fair, and funny representations of their community onto television. The exact thing the Checkers had tried to forbid, the gentle and decent treatment of a gay character, was the exact thing the wider world stood up and applauded. The episode was punished in writing and then rewarded in public, and the reward was for the very quality that nearly buried it. John Waters, the man who voiced John, said something about all of this that captures why the episode worked so well. He explained his whole approach to changing how people think. He said that the only way to change anyone's opinion is to make them laugh first. That is the secret hiding inside Homer's phobia. It does not lecture. It does not wag its finger or preach at the audience about how they ought to behave. It just makes you laugh at Homer, at his silly panic, at how foolish his fear looks. And while you are laughing at the fearful man, you quietly come to see that the fear is the joke, that John is wonderful, and that Homer is the one who needs to grow. The lesson sneaks in through the laughter. By the time the episode ends and Homer accepts his friend, the audience has been gently led to the same place, never once feeling shoved there. That is a far more powerful way to change a mind than any speech could ever be. It is worth pausing on how brave the structure of the episode really is, because it would have been easy to do it the cowardly way. A lazier show would have made the gay character the punchline. It would have invited the audience to laugh at John, to treat his very nature as the joke. Homer's phobia does the opposite, and that choice is the whole reason it earned its praise instead of scorn. The laughter is always aimed at the fearful, ignorant man, never at the kind and confident one. John is allowed his dignity from beginning to end. He is the smartest, warmest, most comfortable person in every room he walks into. The thing being mocked is small-mindedness itself, the foolish idea that you could catch someone's nature by standing near them, the panic of a father who does not understand his own son. By pointing the laughter in that direction, the episode managed to be both genuinely funny and genuinely kind at the same time, which is a hard and rare thing to pull off. The whole near disaster also reveals something quietly important about that hidden checking process and how blunt and clumsy it can be. The people who guard what airs are not always guarding against real harm. Sometimes they are simply guarding against anything new, anything that makes them nervous, anything that has not been done before. There was nothing cruel or dangerous in Homer's phobia. There was no real reason it should have frightened anyone. Its whole message was one of kindness and acceptance. And yet, a group of people with the power to stop it looked at that kindness and saw a threat, purely because the subject was unfamiliar and made them uneasy. Had it not been for a sudden shakeup at the top of the company, an accident of timing that had nothing to do with the episode at all, one of the show's warmest and most honored half hours powers would have vanished into a drawer unseen. The decent thing the writers tried to do would have been smothered, not because it was wrong, but because the people in charge were afraid of it. There is a strange echo here with other stories in the show's history. Time and again, the meaning of an episode and the fate of an episode came down to forces far outside the cartoon itself. An episode buried because of a documentary about a real man. A character recast because of a wider change in the world. And now an episode saved purely by chance because one powerful person happened to be fired at just the right moment. The show that millions watched as a finished, polished thing was, behind the scenes, always at the mercy of accidents, of timing, of who happened to hold power on a given day. Homer's phobia exists today, beloved and award-winning, watched by people who have no idea how close it came to never existing at all, only because of a stroke of luck in an office far from the screen. And the world it helped nudge forward kept moving. In the years that followed, the episode came to be seen as something of a landmark, an early and important step in a long road toward treating gay characters as full people on television, rather than as jokes or warnings. At the time it aired, openly gay characters were a rarity on popular shows, and the few that existed were too often there only to be laughed at. Homer's phobia helped crack that open. It put a gay man on screen who was funny because he was charming, not because his nature was a punchline. And it let a beloved, foolish, everyman character learn to accept him in front of millions of viewers. For a great many people watching, especially young people who were themselves gay and rarely saw kindness aimed their way on television, that mattered in a way that is hard to measure. A single episode of a cartoon cannot change a whole world, but it can be one small, warm push in a better direction, and this one was. So the episode they tried to bury became one of the episodes the show is proudest of. It was called Unacceptable, and it won the highest honors. It was deemed too shameful to show, and it was praised as a model of decency. The very thing that nearly destroyed it became the very thing that made it great, and it all hung on a thread, on a firing in a high office that no writer planned and no one could have counted on. Pull that one accident out of the story, and the whole brave, gentle, award-winning thing collapses into nothing. That is how close it came. That is how fragile even the show's finest moments sometimes were. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The fights and the lucky breaks and the controversies have, until now, mostly been about single episodes, single choices, single moments where the show stepped on a rake or dodged a bullet. But there is a larger controversy that hangs over the entire later life of the show, one that is not about any one episode at all. It is a quieter, sadder argument, and it is the one fans have perhaps argued about the longest and most bitterly. The next chapter steps back from the single moments to face the biggest question of all, the one that asks not whether a single episode went too far, but whether the show, somewhere along its endless road, simply stopped being what it once was. Section 10. The show that outlived itself. There is a question that hangs over The Simpsons like a long shadow, and it is the one fans have argued about more bitterly and for more years than any single episode could ever cause. It is not about a joke that went too far. It is not about a country that got angry or a voice that fell silent. It is a quieter, sadder question, and it goes like this. Did the show, somewhere along its endless road, simply stop being the thing that made everyone fall in love with it in the first place? Did it outlive its own greatness and keep walking long after the magic had drained away? To understand why people even ask this, you have to understand just how long The Simpsons has been on the air. Most shows live a few years and then end. They have a beginning, a middle, and a goodbye. The Simpsons has refused to end for decades. It began in the late 1980s and never stopped. It has produced hundreds upon hundreds of episodes, more than almost any other scripted show in the history of television. A child who watched the very first episodes grew up, grew old, and had children of their own who could watch brand new episodes of the same show. That kind of lifespan is almost unheard of, and it creates a strange and unique problem that shorter shows never have to face. When something lasts that long, people inevitably start comparing the show it is now to the show it used to be, and for many longtime fans, that comparison is painful. The argument episode splits the show's life into two rough halves. There is the early stretch, the years that fans came to call the Golden Age, when the show was at the absolute peak of its powers. And then there is everything after, the long later period that many fans feel never quite recaptured that early brilliance. Where exactly the line falls is part of what people fight about, but there is broad agreement that those first several seasons were something special, a run of episodes so sharp and so heartfelt that they reshaped what a cartoon could be. The stories in those years tended to be smaller and more human, built around real feelings and recognizable troubles. The jokes were dense and clever. The characters felt true. People did not just laugh at those early episodes, they were moved by them. We have already walked straight into the heart of where many fans believe the decline began. It was an episode we covered earlier, the one about the principal who turned out to be a man named Armin Tamzarian. For a great many viewers, that episode, sitting at the start of the 9th season, became the marker, the spot on the timeline where they would point and say that this was where things started to slip. It was the episode that took a character people trusted and revealed it had all been a swap, and it left a lot of fans feeling that the show had begun caring more about wild, gimmicky stories than about the honest human moments that had made it great. The fact that the show's own creator and one of its own voice actors openly disliked that episode only added weight to the feeling. If the people making the show were unhappy with it, fans reasoned, perhaps it really was a turning point. The complaint, broadly, is about a shift in flavor. Fans who feel the show declined tend to describe the change in similar ways. The early episodes, they say, were grounded. Homer was a foolish but loving father, whose mistakes came from a recognizable place. The family felt like a real family, struggling with money, with school, with the ordinary aches of life. Then, over time, the argument goes, things drifted. Homer grew louder and dumber, his foolishness swelling into something cartoonish and mean. The stories grew bigger and stranger, reaching for spectacle and far-flung adventures rather than the small, true troubles of the early years. The jokes, some say, got broader and easier. The heart, the thing that made you feel something underneath the laughter, seemed to thin out. The show was still funny, still polished, still watched by millions. But to these fans, it had become a kind of loud echo of its old self, going through the familiar motions without the soul that once filled them. Now, this is where honesty matters, because this argument is not settled fact. It is a feeling, widely shared, but still a feeling, and it deserves to be treated as one. Not everyone agrees that the show declined. Plenty of people have pointed out that the later seasons still contain wonderful episodes, that the show has kept finding clever things to say, and that the Golden Age may glow so brightly in memory partly because of nostalgia, the warm haze that settles over the things we loved when we were young. There is a real possibility that some of the supposed decline lives less in the episodes themselves and more in the people watching them, who first met the show as children seeing the world fresh and now meet it as adults who have seen everything before. A joke that floored you at 10 may only earn a small smile at 30, and that change is in you as much as in the show. So the decline, real as it feels to many, is at least partly a story about how we age alongside the things we love. But here is the most fascinating part of this whole long argument, the thing that lifts it above a simple grumble. The show knows. The Simpsons is fully, painfully aware that people think it got worse, and rather than hiding from that belief, it is turned around and joked about it again and again, right there on the screen. This is a show with a long history of laughing at itself, and its own supposed decline became one of its favorite targets. We saw this self-awareness earlier in how the writers mocked their own most hated episode, having a character pointedly call the principal by his secret name years later, a quiet wink that they had not forgotten the mess they made. That same willingness to poke fun at its own failings runs all through the show's later life. The show has, in various ways, openly acknowledged that it has been on the air a very long time, that it perhaps should have ended long ago, that it keeps going partly out of sheer momentum. It has made jokes at its own expense about running out of ideas, about repeating itself, about being a show that simply will not stop. This is a strange and rare thing for any program to do. Most shows pretend to be as fresh as ever right up to the end. The Simpsons instead chose to look its audience in the eye and admit, through humor, that it hears the complaints, that it knows what people say about it, that it understands it may be a shadow of its former self, and that it is going to keep going anyway. There is something almost brave in that, and something a little sad too. It is a show that has learned to laugh at its own decline, because the alternative, perhaps, would be to take the decline too seriously, or to stop altogether. This self-mockery is itself a kind of argument in the larger fight. Some fans find it charming, proof that the cleverness is still there, that a show able to laugh this honestly at itself cannot be entirely empty. Others find it frustrating, a way of dodging the real problem by joking about it. If you know you have gotten worse, this side argues, then do something about it, or end with dignity, rather than turning the decline into yet another punchline. The jokes about being past its prime become, for these fans, just more evidence of the prime being gone. There is no winning that argument cleanly, because both readings are true at once. The self-awareness is genuinely clever, and it is also a kind of shrug. Underneath all of it sits a deeper question about what a show even owes its audience over time. When something becomes beloved, the people who love it begin to feel a sort of ownership over it. They want it to stay the way they remember. They want the magic preserved, frozen, protected, and a show that keeps making new episodes can never do that. Every new episode is a risk to the memory of the old ones. Every new story that falls flat becomes another piece of evidence for the decline. In a strange way, the longer The Simpsons lives, the more it endangers its own legend, because each passing year adds more episodes to be measured against the impossibly high bar set by its youth. A show that had ended after its golden years would be remembered as flawless, untouchable, gone too soon. A show that refuses to end must instead be remembered as something more complicated, a thing that was once great and then simply kept being, for better and for worse. There is a real cost to that, and the fans who mourn the golden age are mourning something true. They are not wrong that the early episodes had a quality the later ones often lack. The smallness, the heart, the density of the jokes, the sense that every episode was crafted with enormous care. Those qualities were real, and time did change them, but there is also a cost to the other path, the path the show did not take. Had The Simpsons ended at its peak, the world would never have gotten the hundreds of episodes that came after, and among those hundreds, even the harshest critic would admit, are real gems, episodes that made people laugh and feel and think. To wish the show had ended is also to wish away everything good that came in the long years since. The argument has no clean answer, because the choice itself had no clean answer. To stop is to die young and stay golden. To continue is to grow old in public, with all the slips and stumbles that growing old brings. And so the show kept choosing to continue, season after season, decade after decade, fully aware of what people said, joking about it, surviving it. It became something no one quite planned for, a show so long-lived that it turned into a kind of monument to its own endurance. The question of whether it declined is, in the end, almost beside the point of what it has become. It is the show that would not end. It is the cartoon that outlived nearly all its rivals, that watched competitors rise and fall while it simply kept going, that became less a single show and more a permanent fixture of the television landscape, always there, always on, as reliable and unchanging as the sun coming up. Whether that fixture still burns as bright as it once did is a question every fan answers differently, depending on what they want from it and how old they were when they first found it. What can be said for certain is that very few things in the history of television have ever been loved enough and lasted long enough to even earn this kind of mournful argument. You do not grieve the decline of something you never cared about. The very fact that fans argue so fiercely about whether the show got worse is, underneath the complaint, a strange kind of tribute. It means the show mattered enough that people are still keeping watch over it, still measuring it, still holding it to the towering standard of its best years. A show that was merely fine would have been forgotten long ago. Only a show that once reached greatness could make people this sad about the possibility that it slipped. The decline debate, for all its bitterness, is proof of how high the show once climbed. You can only fall from a great height if you were once standing at the top. So the controversy over the show outliving itself is really the controversy of love stretched across too many years. It is what happened happens when something wonderful refuses to leave, and the people who adored it are left to watch it age, comparing what it is to what it was, unable to stop caring even as they complain. The early episodes remain perfect and golden, available to anyone who wants to return to them. The later episodes pile up beside them, a mixed and endless heap, some bright and some dull, and the show goes on, laughing at itself, hearing every word the fans say, and choosing, year after year, to keep being a show rather than become a memory. That choice, to keep going rather than to end, is the thread that ties this final controversy back to every one that came before it. Each earlier storm, the silenced voice, the buried episode, the angry country, the swapped character, the recast cast, the predictions, the dreaming man, the dark mirror, the episode nearly banned, all of them are pieces of a single enormous life. A life so long that it gathered more controversy than any show was ever built to hold. And every one of those storms was survivable for the exact same reason. The show was simply too big, too beloved, and too stubborn to be brought down by any single one of them. So what are we really left with after walking through all of it? Not a list of scandals, not a case for the show being good or bad, golden or faded. We are left with the portrait of something that lived long enough to make every kind of mistake, weather every kind of anger, and still be standing when the dust settled. A yellow family on a couch, refusing to fade. Every other show eventually packs up and says goodbye. This one stayed. It stayed through the apologies and the lawsuits, through the buried episodes and the angry letters, through the fans who loved it and the fans who swore it had lost its way. And it is still there tonight, glowing quietly in millions of homes, exactly where it has always been. The controversies will keep coming, because anything that lives this long keeps giving the world new reasons to argue about it. But so will the show, and maybe that is the truest thing that can be said about The Simpsons in the end. Not that it was perfect, and not that it was flawless, but that it refused to leave, and that we are all, quietly, a little glad it never did. So settle in, let the television hum, and let that strange, stubborn, endless little town keep the lights on a while longer. It is in no hurry to go anywhere, and neither, it seems, are we.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.